The rain fell softly against the tall windows of the Grand Meridian Hotel, each drop tracing a path down the glass like tears the building itself couldn't hold back. Inside the glittering ballroom, crystal chandeliers cast warm golden light across polished marble floors, illuminating designer gowns and tailored tuxedos that cost more than most people earned in a year. Champagne flutes clinked, laughter echoed off vaulted ceilings, and the air smelled of expensive perfume and old money. This was the annual Rosewood Foundation Gala, where the city's elite gathered to celebrate their success and write checks that would ease their consciences until next year's event. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Among the sea of silk and diamonds stood a man who didn't quite belong, or so it seemed to everyone who glanced his way. His name was Daniel Reeves, and the navy blue suit he wore had seen better days. The fabric was clean but thin at the elbows, the cut dated by at least a decade, and the shoes on his feet carried scuff marks no amount of polish could completely hide. He stood near the hors d'oeuvres table, his broad shoulders slightly hunched as if trying to make himself smaller, less noticeable in a room full of people who commanded attention simply by breathing. If you believe that dignity has nothing to do with designer labels, that a person's worth can't be measured by the price tag on their clothing, then you need to hear what happens next. Daniel hadn't wanted to come tonight. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks ago, embossed lettering on cream-colored cardstock that felt heavy in his hands, and his first instinct had been to throw it away. Charity galas weren't his world. They never had been. But his daughter Emma, bright-eyed and 10 years old with her mother's smile and his stubborn determination, had found the invitation on the kitchen counter and insisted he attend. She'd been learning about philanthropy in school, she'd explained earnestly, and wouldn't it be amazing if her dad could go and see how rich people helped others? How could he say no to that face, those hopeful eyes that still believed the world was fundamentally good? So he'd pulled his old suit from the back of his closet, the one he'd worn to job interviews in his brother's wedding years ago, and he'd shown up. Daniel was a single father, and that identity defined nearly every choice he made. 3 years ago, his wife Sarah had passed away suddenly from an aneurysm, leaving him alone with a 7-year-old daughter and a grief so profound it felt like drowning. There had been dark months where getting out of bed felt impossible, where every corner of their small apartment held memories that caught like broken glass. But Emma needed him. She needed breakfast and clean clothes and someone to read bedtime stories, and so Daniel had learned to function through the fog of loss. He worked as a maintenance supervisor at Lincoln Elementary School, the same school Emma attended. It wasn't glamorous work. He fixed leaky faucets, repaired broken lockers, kept the boilers running through harsh Chicago winters, and made sure the building was safe for the hundreds of children who walked through its doors each morning. The pay was modest, the hours were long, and his hands were perpetually stained with grease no soap could fully remove. But it was honest work, and it allowed him to be there when Emma got out of class, to walk her home, to help with homework at the kitchen table while she told him about her day. What most people at the school didn't know, what Daniel kept quietly to himself, was that he'd once lived a very different life. Before Sarah died, before Emma was born, before he chose the path of simplicity and presence, Daniel had served in the French Foreign Legion. For 8 years, he'd been part of one of the world's most elite military forces, stationed everywhere from the deserts of Mali to the mountains of Afghanistan. He'd earned commendations for bravery, led men through impossible situations, and held a rank that came with respect and authority. But when Sarah became pregnant, Daniel made a choice. He wanted to be a present father, not a soldier deployed to distant wars. He wanted to tuck his child in at night, not wonder if he'd survive to see her grow up. So he'd left that life behind. He'd returned to civilian life, taken the maintenance job that offered stability and proximity to his family, and never looked back. The medals and commendations sat in a box in his closet, gathering dust alongside old photographs and folded uniforms. He didn't talk about his past. It felt like showing off, and besides, who would believe that the quiet man who unclogged toilets and changed light bulbs had once jumped out of helicopters into combat zones? The invitation to tonight's gala had come because of his work with the school's after-hours program. Daniel volunteered 3 evenings a week, helping students from low-income families with their homework, teaching them basic repair skills, and just being a steady adult presence for kids who didn't always have that at home. The principal, recognizing his dedication, had nominated him for the Rosewood Foundation's Community Service Recognition, and apparently he'd been selected as one of 5 honorees. The letter had been kind, explaining that his presence at the gala would be appreciated, that there would be a brief moment where each honoree would be acknowledged. Daniel had almost declined anyway. The thought of standing in front of wealthy strangers while they applauded politely before returning to their conversations about vacation homes and stock portfolios made his skin crawl. But Emma had been so excited, so proud of her dad, that he couldn't bring himself to disappoint her. So here he stood, in his threadbare suit, feeling like an actor who'd wandered onto the wrong stage. He'd arrived early, before the crowd thickened, and had immediately felt the weight of curious glances. A few people had smiled politely, the kind of smile you give someone you're trying to place but can't quite remember. Most simply looked through him, their eyes sliding past his unremarkable appearance to find someone more interesting, more important, more worth their time. Daniel was used to being invisible. In many ways, he preferred it. Attention meant questions, and questions meant explaining a past he'd rather leave buried. He picked up a small plate and placed a few canapes on it, more to have something to do with his hands than out of actual hunger. The food was beautiful, tiny works of art that probably cost more per bite than his entire lunch budget for a week. He ate one slowly, tasting caviar and creme fraiche and feeling absurdly out of place. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Around him, conversations flowed in practiced cadences. Stock market trends. Upcoming vacations to Tuscany and the Maldives. Children attending prestigious boarding schools. Real estate investments. It was a language he'd never learned to speak. Daniel checked his watch. The program wouldn't start for another 30 minutes. He wondered if he could slip away, claim a sudden illness, and be home in time to read Emma her bedtime story. She was staying with his sister tonight, probably already in her pajamas, hopefully not giving Aunt Rachel too much trouble. He'd promised to tell her all about the gala tomorrow over their Saturday morning pancakes. What would he say? That he'd felt like a janitor at a ball, tolerated but not welcomed? He was considering his exit strategy when a voice cut through his thoughts, sharp and clear as breaking ice. The voice belonged to a woman who'd just approached the hors d'oeuvres table, and it was pitched loud enough that several people nearby turned to look. Daniel glanced up and found himself face to face with elegance wrapped in disdain. She was tall, probably in her early 50s, with platinum blonde hair swept into an elaborate updo and an emerald green gown that shimmered under the chandelier light. Diamonds dripped from her ears and throat, catching the light with every movement. Her makeup was flawless, her posture perfect, and her expression suggested she'd just noticed something unpleasant stuck to her expensive shoe. She wasn't looking at Daniel exactly. She was looking at his suit. Her eyes traveled from his scuffed shoes up to his outdated jacket, lingering on the thin patches at his elbows, the slightly frayed collar of his shirt. Her lip curled almost imperceptibly, and when she finally met his gaze, her eyes held the kind of pity that feels more like contempt. The woman turned to her companion, another elegantly dressed woman with silver hair and pearls, and spoke in a voice clearly meant to be overheard. The woman's voice carried across the marble floor like a stone skipping across water, each word deliberate and designed to wound. Her name was Victoria Ashford, though Daniel didn't know that yet. What he did know, what everyone within earshot immediately understood, was that she wanted him to hear every syllable of what came next. "Honestly, Margaret, I don't understand how they let just anyone into these events anymore," Victoria said, her eyes still fixed on Daniel's worn suit. "There used to be standards. A certain level of decorum. Now it seems if you can fog a mirror, they'll hand you an invitation." She plucked a champagne flute from a passing waiter's tray with manicured fingers that had never known a day of hard work. "I mean, look at that suit. It's practically falling apart. Did he rent it from a costume shop? Goodwill perhaps?" Her companion Margaret shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting between Victoria and Daniel. "Victoria, perhaps we should," she began, but Victoria waved her off like she was shooing away an annoying insect. "I'm simply stating facts, Margaret. This is the Rosewood Foundation Gala, not a church potluck. We pay $20,000 per table to be here. The least the organizers could do is maintain some semblance of class." She took a sip of her champagne, her gaze never leaving Daniel. "I suppose they needed to fill seats. Charity cases helping charity cases. How delightfully meta." Daniel felt heat rising up his neck. He'd faced enemy fire with less discomfort than he felt in this moment. In combat, you knew who your enemies were. They wore different uniforms and carried weapons. Here, the enemy wore Chanel and wielded words like precision instruments designed to cut without leaving visible scars. He could walk away. That would be the smart thing, the easy thing. But something kept his feet planted on that polished marble floor. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the thought of Emma asking him about the gala tomorrow, her eyes wide with curiosity. What would he tell her? That he'd run away the first time someone was cruel? A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the unmistakable scent of social drama. People pretended to examine the flower arrangements or study their phones, but Daniel could feel their attention like heat lamps pointed in his direction. Victoria noticed the audience too, and it seemed to embolden her. She turned fully toward Daniel now, addressing him directly for the first time. "Tell me," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Are you here with the catering staff? Did you get lost on your way to the kitchen? I only ask because, well..." She gestured vaguely at his appearance. "You clearly didn't dress for the occasion. Unless the occasion is a funeral for fashion sense." Someone in the small crowd laughed, a quick nervous sound quickly stifled. Margaret touched Victoria's arm gently. "That's enough," she whispered, but Victoria shook her off. "No, I think it's important to address. We work incredibly hard for our success, Margaret. We earn our place in rooms like this. We dress appropriately, we contribute meaningfully, we uphold certain standards. When those standards are ignored, when they let anyone wander in off the street, it diminishes what we've built. It's disrespectful to everyone here who actually belongs." Daniel's jaw tightened. He thought about responding, about explaining that he'd been invited, that he was being honored tonight for his community service. But the words felt stuck in his throat, trapped behind years of choosing silence over confrontation, of keeping his head down and his past buried. What would he say anyway? That he was sorry for not owning a better suit? That he'd used his clothing budget to buy Emma new shoes because she was growing so fast? That he thought character mattered more than thread count? Before he could decide, another voice joined the conversation. This one belonged to a man in his 60s with silver hair and a tuxedo that probably cost more than Daniel's monthly rent. He stood next to Victoria, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. His face carried the self-satisfied expression of someone accustomed to being right simply because he had the money to make it so. "Victoria darling, what seems to be the problem?" he asked, though his eyes on Daniel suggested he already knew exactly what the problem was. "No problem, Richard. Just noting how the standards have fallen. Look at this poor man's suit. It's shameful really. If he couldn't afford appropriate attire, he should have stayed home. There's no shame in knowing your limitations, in understanding when you're out of your depth." She turned back to Daniel, her expression shifting to something that might have been mistaken for concern if not for the cruelty in her eyes. "Truly, I mean no offense. I'm sure you're a perfectly nice person. But this," she gestured at the opulent ballroom, the glittering crowd, the obvious wealth surrounding them, "this isn't your world. You must feel terribly uncomfortable. Perhaps it would be kinder if you simply excused yourself. Saved yourself the embarrassment." The crowd around them had grown larger now. Daniel counted at least 15 people openly watching, probably more observing from a distance. Their faces showed varying degrees of discomfort, curiosity, and in a few cases, barely concealed amusement. No one stepped forward to defend him. No one told Victoria she was out of line. This was her world, after all. These were her people. Daniel was just the interloper in the cheap suit who'd wandered in by mistake. He felt something crack inside him then, not breaking exactly but shifting. It was the same feeling he'd had years ago in a desert outside of Gao, pinned down by hostile fire with 3 injured men under his command and no clear exit strategy. The moment when you realize that dignity isn't about what others think of you, but about what you know to be true about yourself. The moment when you decide that retreat isn't an option, even when it's the easier path. Daniel set his plate down on the table with deliberate care. He straightened his shoulders, pulling himself up to his full height. He'd spent years making himself small, unobtrusive, invisible. But before he'd been a maintenance supervisor, before he'd been a grieving widower, before he'd been a father, he'd been a soldier. And soldiers didn't flee from discomfort. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his voice steady and clear. "I appreciate your concern about standards. But I was invited here tonight by the Rosewood Foundation. I didn't crash the party. I didn't sneak in through the kitchen. I received an invitation because of work I've done in this community." He paused, meeting her gaze directly. "As for my suit, you're right. It's old. It's worn, it's the only one I own. But it's clean, and it's honest, and it's covered the back of a man who shows up every day to make life better for children who don't have much. So if that offends your sense of decorum, I apologize. But I won't apologize for being here." The words hung in the air between them. Victoria's expression flickered, surprise dancing across her features before settling back into disdain. She opened her mouth to respond, but Richard cut her off. "Listen, friend," Richard said, his tone attempting reasonableness but landing somewhere closer to condescension. "Nobody's questioning your character. I'm sure you're very dedicated to your job, whatever that may be. But Victoria has a point. These events have a certain atmosphere, a certain expectation. When someone shows up looking like they can't afford the cover charge, it changes the energy of the room. It makes people uncomfortable. Surely you can understand that." "What I understand," Daniel replied, his voice still calm but carrying an edge now, "is that you're both more concerned with appearances than substance. More worried about the price of fabric than the content of character. And if that's what defines your world, then maybe you're right. Maybe this isn't where I belong." Victoria's laugh was sharp and brittle. "Well, at least we agree on something. Self-awareness is so rare these days. Most people in your position would be scrambling to defend themselves, making excuses, claiming they're just as good as everyone else despite clear evidence to the contrary." She turned to the crowd, playing to her audience now. "Isn't it refreshing when someone simply accepts reality?" Several people shifted uncomfortably. A few looked away. But still, no one spoke up. Daniel wondered if they agreed with Victoria or if they were simply too comfortable to risk rocking the boat. Probably both. These were people who'd learned long ago that staying silent when injustice was convenient meant you got to keep your place at the table. Margaret finally found her voice, though it was small and uncertain. "Victoria, perhaps we should move along. The program is starting soon." "In a moment," Victoria said, waving her hand dismissively. She studied Daniel like he was an interesting specimen under glass. "I'm curious now. What exactly do you do that warranted an invitation to an event like this? Please, enlighten us. What great contribution have you made to society?" Daniel could have walked away then. Should have, probably. The smart move was to disengage, to find the organizer who'd invited him and explain that he'd changed his mind about being honored. He could be in a taxi within 10 minutes, home within 30, changed out of this cursed suit and back in his comfortable anonymity. But Emma's face floated through his mind. Her excitement about the gala. Her pride in her father. What lesson would he teach her if he ran? That cruelty wins? That wealthy people get to decide who has value? That you should hide who you are because someone might mock your clothes? "I work at Lincoln Elementary School," Daniel said simply. "I'm the maintenance supervisor. I also volunteer 3 nights a week with students who need extra help. Reading, homework, basic life skills. Kids whose parents work multiple jobs and can't always be there. Kids who need someone to show up consistently, to believe in them, to see their potential even when no one else does. He paused, watching Victoria's expression remain unchanged. The Rosewood Foundation selected me as one of 5 community service honorees tonight. That's why I'm here. Not because I bought my way in, not because I have connections, but because someone decided that the work I do matters. That helping children matters more than designer labels. Victoria's perfectly painted lips curved into a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. She exchanged a glance with Richard, and something unspoken passed between them. It was the look of people who just confirmed their suspicions, who felt vindicated in their initial assessment. Daniel watched her take another delicate sip of champagne before she spoke again, and he knew before the words left her mouth that whatever came next would be worse than what had come before. A maintenance supervisor, she repeated slowly, as if tasting each syllable. How absolutely charming. So you're a janitor. You mop floors and unclog toilets and change light bulbs, and someone gave you a participation trophy for showing up to work. Her laugh tinkled like breaking glass. Oh, this is rich. This is absolutely priceless. Richard, did you hear? Our friend here is being honored for doing his job. What's next? Should we give awards to garbage collectors for picking up trash? Should we throw galas for bus drivers who arrive on time? The crowd around them had swelled to at least 30 people now, a ring of designer gowns and expensive suits forming a human amphitheater around the confrontation. Daniel could see phones being discreetly angled in his direction, no doubt capturing video for social media. Tomorrow, this moment would be someone's entertainment, a story to share over brunch about the awkward scene at the Rosewood Gala. He wondered how they'd caption it. Probably something about knowing your place or staying in your lane. Richard joined in now, emboldened by his wife's cruelty. I don't mean to pile on, but Victoria does raise a valid point. Community service awards are meant to recognize exceptional contributions. Volunteering a few hours a week to help kids with homework, while admirable in its own small way, hardly seems worthy of recognition at an event of this caliber. He gestured around the opulent ballroom. Everyone here has contributed significantly to various causes. Victoria and I personally donated $3 million to the Pediatric Cancer Research Wing at Children's Memorial Hospital. That's the kind of impact that merits recognition. $3.2 million actually, Victoria corrected, her tone making it clear she wanted credit for every dollar. And we're not bragging. We simply believe in maintaining perspective. There are people who write checks that change lives, who fund research that saves children, who build hospitals and schools and programs that actually matter, and then there are people who volunteer a few hours between fixing toilets. Both are fine, I suppose, but let's not pretend they're equivalent. Daniel felt his hands curl into fists at his sides. He forced them to relax, forced his breathing to stay steady. Years of military discipline served him well now, keeping his voice level even as anger burned in his chest like swallowed fire. I'm not pretending anything is equivalent, he said quietly. I'm just here because I was invited. I didn't ask for recognition. I didn't nominate myself. I just do what I do because it needs doing. How very noble, Victoria said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. The humble janitor who doesn't seek recognition. Except here you are, wearing your pathetic suit to an event where you clearly don't belong, hoping to rub shoulders with your betters. Hoping someone might notice you and think you're special. She leaned in slightly, her perfume overwhelming. Let me give you some free advice. Know your place. There's no shame in being a janitor, but there is shame in pretending you're something more. In thinking that showing up to this gala somehow elevates you to our level. Margaret had given up trying to restrain Victoria. She stood slightly apart now, her discomfort visible but her loyalty to her friend apparently stronger than her moral compass. Several other people in the crowd shifted their weight, glanced at their watches, examined their fingernails with sudden intensity. The discomfort was palpable, but still, no one intervened. Daniel understood why. Victoria Ashford was a name that mattered in Chicago social circles. She sat on boards, hosted fundraisers, had connections that could make or break careers. Standing up to her meant risking exclusion from rooms like this, and for most of these people, that price was too high. A young woman in a red dress standing near the edge of the crowd caught Daniel's eye. She was younger than most attendees, probably in her late 20s, and her expression was one of genuine distress. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, her courage failing her. Daniel gave her a small nod. "It's okay," the gesture said. "I understand." She looked away, shame coloring her cheeks. "You know what I think?" Victoria continued, warming to her theme now. She addressed the crowd as much as Daniel, performing for her audience. "I think the Rosewood Foundation made a mistake. I think someone on their committee got a little too enthusiastic about diversity or inclusion or whatever buzzword is trendy this year. They wanted to show that they care about the little people, the working class heroes, so they found a janitor who volunteers and decided to parade him around like a show pony. Look how progressive we are. We honor the help." Several people in the crowd nodded. A few smiled. Daniel saw it clearly now, the solidarity forming among those who felt their position threatened by his presence. He wasn't just a man in a cheap suit. He represented something more dangerous. The possibility that wealth and status weren't the only measures of worth. That someone like him could stand in a room like this and claim equal value. It was easier to mock him, to dismiss him, to push him back down where he belonged. Richard checked his Rolex, a movement deliberately calculated to show off the expensive timepiece. "I hate to cut this fascinating conversation short, but we really should find our table. The program starts in 15 minutes, and I believe the silent auction closes soon." I had my eye on the Tuscany Villa package. He looked at Daniel with something that might have been pity if it weren't so clearly contempt. "I'm sure they have your seat somewhere. Probably near the back. Near the kitchen perhaps, where you might feel more at home." Victoria laughed at this, a genuine sound of delight. "Oh Richard, that's awful." But her tone suggested she found it perfectly appropriate. She smoothed down her emerald gown and prepared to move on, clearly feeling she'd said everything that needed saying. The entertainment was over. Time to return to more important matters. But then something unexpected happened. A voice cut through the murmuring crowd, clear and commanding and carrying an accent that made several heads turn. "Excusez-moi, but I believe there has been some confusion here." The crowd parted like water, and through the gap came a man in his early 70s with silver hair swept back from a distinguished face. He wore his tuxedo with the kind of natural ease that suggested he'd been born in formal wear. His posture was military straight, his stride purposeful, and the small pin on his lapel bore the colors of the French flag. Several people in the crowd recognized him immediately. Their expressions shifted from curiosity to something approaching awe. Daniel recognized him too, though it had been years since they'd last seen each other. His stomach tightened. This couldn't be happening. Not here. Not now. The man stopped directly in front of Daniel, ignoring Victoria and Richard completely despite their obvious importance. His eyes, sharp and blue as winter sky, studied Daniel's face for a long moment. Then, slowly and deliberately, he smiled. It was a smile of recognition, of respect, of shared history that spoke louder than any words could. "Commander Reeves," the man said, his French accent wrapping around the English words like silk. "It has been too long, mon ami." The silence that fell over the crowd was absolute. Victoria's champagne flute stopped halfway to her lips. Richard's mouth opened slightly, no sound emerging. Margaret's eyes went wide. The young woman in the red dress covered her mouth with her hand. Phones that had been recording the spectacle now angled desperately to capture this new development. "Commander." The word hung in the air like a note from a perfectly tuned instrument. Daniel felt his military training kick in automatically. His spine straightened, his shoulders squared, and when he spoke, his voice carried the crisp precision of someone accustomed to giving orders that determined life and death. "Colonel Beaumont. This is unexpected." Colonel Laurent Beaumont, French ambassador to the United States and former commanding officer in the Foreign Legion, extended his hand. Daniel shook it, their grip firm and familiar. Unexpected perhaps, but welcome, no? I saw your name on the list of honorees tonight and I said to myself, Laurent, you must attend this gala. You must see your old friend. You must thank him properly for saving your life. Victoria made a small choking sound. Several people gasped. Daniel felt heat rising up his neck, not from embarrassment now but from the uncomfortable spotlight of sudden attention. This was exactly what he'd tried to avoid for years. The questions. The explanations. The inevitable revelation of a past he'd worked so hard to leave behind. That was a long time ago, sir, Daniel said quietly, trying to downplay the moment. Ancient history. Ancient history? Beaumont's eyebrows rose dramatically. Mon Dieu, you have not changed. Still the humble warrior, yes? Still pretending that what you did was nothing special. He turned to address the crowd, his voice carrying easily across the marble floor. Let me tell you all about your ancient history, my friend, since you are too modest to speak of it yourself. Daniel wanted to stop him, to redirect the conversation, to find some way to exit this moment with his privacy intact. But Beaumont had already begun, and there was no stopping him now. The ambassador had always loved a good story, and this was one he'd told many times over the years. I met Commander Reeves, Beaumont said, emphasizing the rank deliberately, in Mali. The year was 2012. I was not yet an ambassador then, just a colonel leading an operation in very difficult circumstances. We had intelligence about a terrorist cell planning attacks against civilian targets. My unit was sent to intercept them. He paused, his expression growing serious. It was an ambush. They knew we were coming. We walked into a kill zone in the middle of the desert. The crowd was absolutely transfixed now. Victoria and Richard stood frozen, their earlier smugness replaced by something approaching horror as they began to understand the magnitude of their mistake. Margaret had gone pale. The young woman in red had tears streaming down her face. We lost 3 men in the first 30 seconds, Beaumont continued. The rest of us were pinned down behind our vehicles, taking fire from 3 directions. No cover. No reinforcements. Temperature was 45 degrees Celsius. We had maybe 2 hours before we ran out of ammunition, and the enemy had all the time in the world. He smiled sadly at the memory. I thought that day would be my last. I made peace with it, you understand? I was ready. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. He remembered that day with painful clarity. The heat, the sand, the sound of bullets hitting metal, the screams of injured men. The impossible calculation of odds that said they were all going to die unless someone did something desperate. But then, Beaumont said, his voice rising with emotion, this man right here, this commander that someone tonight called a janitor in a cheap suit, he did something I have never forgotten. Something I will never forget. He volunteered to draw their fire. To create a diversion so the rest of us could reposition and gain tactical advantage. The ambassador's eyes were wet now. He walked into an open kill zone. Alone. Armed with nothing but his rifle and his courage. And he held them off long enough for us to flank their position and turn the tide. Beaumont stepped closer to Daniel, placing both hands on his shoulders. You took 7 bullets that day. 7. 3 in your vest, for that went through. You lost so much blood that the medic thought you were already dead. But you survived. And because you survived, because you were willing to sacrifice yourself, 22 other men survived. 22 men went home to their families. 22 men got to live full lives because one man understood what service really means. The silence now was different than before. It wasn't the silence of cruel entertainment or morbid curiosity. It was the silence of people confronting their own smallness, their own superficiality. Victoria's face had gone from flushed to ashen. Her champagne flute trembled in her hand. Richard stared at Daniel as if seeing a ghost. The confident superiority they'd worn like armor had cracked completely, leaving behind nothing but naked shame. Beaumont wasn't finished. He turned back to the crowd, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. After he recovered, Commander Reeves was awarded the Légion d'honneur, France's highest decoration. He was promoted. He was offered positions of great prestige within the Legion. But you know what he did? He turned it all down. He said he wanted to go home. He wanted to be with his family. He wanted to be present for his daughter. The ambassador shook his head in wonder. Most men who achieve what he achieved, they chase more glory. More medals. More recognition. But not this man. He understood something that very few people ever learn. That being a good father is harder and more important than being a war hero. Daniel felt the weight of dozens of eyes on him, but he kept his gaze fixed on a point somewhere past Beaumont's shoulder. He'd spent 3 years building a quiet life, a simple life, a life where his past didn't define his present. And now, in the space of 5 minutes, that carefully constructed privacy had been stripped away. He wasn't angry at Beaumont. The ambassador had no way of knowing what he'd been through, how hard Daniel had worked to become invisible. But that didn't make this moment any less uncomfortable. Victoria found her voice first, though it came out smaller than before, stripped of its earlier confidence. I didn't know. How could I have known? She looked around desperately, seeking support from the crowd, but found only accusing stares. He didn't say anything. He just stood there in that suit and let me think. Let you think what? Beaumont cut her off sharply. Let you think that a person's worth can be measured by their clothing? Let you think that someone who works with their hands must be less than someone who writes checks? His voice carried an edge now, the warmth replaced by steel. Madam, I have met many wealthy people in my years as an ambassador. I have shaken hands with billionaires and prime ministers and celebrities whose names you would recognize. And I can tell you with absolute certainty that wealth and character rarely occupy the same space. This man, he gestured to Daniel, has more honor in his worn-out shoes than most people have in their entire bodies. Richard tried to salvage something from the wreckage. Ambassador Beaumont, please understand, we meant no real offense. It was simply a misunderstanding. A bit of humor that perhaps went too far. His voice carried a desperate edge now, the sound of a man watching his social standing crumble in real time. We're actually very supportive of veterans. We donate to several military charities. We have nothing but respect for those who serve. Do you? Beaumont's eyebrows rose. Is that the respect I witnessed when I arrived? When I heard you mocking this man's suit, questioning his right to be here, suggesting he should go hide in the kitchen? He stepped closer to Richard, and despite being several inches shorter, somehow made the younger man seem small. You donate money to military charities because it looks good on your tax forms and makes you feel virtuous at dinner parties. But when faced with an actual veteran, a man who gave his blood for values you only pretend to hold, you treat him like garbage. This is not respect, monsieur. This is hypocrisy of the highest order. Margaret stepped forward, her voice shaking. We're so sorry. Truly, we are. If we had known. If you had known, you would have treated him differently, Beaumont finished for her. But why should you need to know someone's history to treat them with basic human dignity? Why should a man need to wave his medals and recount his scars to deserve your respect? He shook his head, disgust evident on his face. This is the problem with people like you. You believe that worth must be proven, that value must be demonstrated through credentials and accomplishments you deem worthy. You cannot simply look at another human being and grant them the respect they deserve simply because they exist. The crowd had grown larger still, swelling to perhaps 70 or 80 people now. Word was spreading through the ballroom like wildfire. Phones were everywhere, capturing every moment, every word. Daniel could already imagine the headlines. Wealthy socialite humiliates war hero. French ambassador defends veteran at charity gala. The janitor who saved lives. He hated all of it. He'd never wanted to be a headline, never wanted his past to become public spectacle. A well-dressed man in his 50s pushed through the crowd, his face flushed with urgency. Daniel recognized him as Thomas Whitmore, the director of the Rosewood Foundation and the man who'd signed the invitation letter. Ambassador Beaumont, Mr. Reeves, I cannot apologize enough for what's happened here tonight. He shot a look of pure fury at Victoria and Richard. Mrs. Ashford, Mr. Ashford, I believe you need to leave. Immediately. Victoria's face went from pale to red. Excuse me? We're major donors to this foundation. We paid $20,000 for our table tonight. You can't possibly be asking us to leave. I'm not asking, Whitmore said coldly. I'm telling you. Your behavior tonight has been appalling, and it has no place at an event dedicated to celebrating community service and human compassion. You have exactly 5 minutes to collect your things and exit the premises, or I will have security escort you out. Richard sputtered, his composure completely shattered. This is outrageous. We've been members of this foundation for 12 years. We sit on the advisory board. You can't treat us like common criminals over a simple misunderstanding. A simple misunderstanding? Whitmore's voice rose enough that people across the ballroom turned to look. You publicly humiliated one of our honorees. You mocked his appearance, questioned his worth, and suggested he didn't belong here. You did all of this loudly enough for dozens of people to hear, and you did it with such casual cruelty that it's clear this isn't the first time you've treated someone this way. He pulled out his phone. I have 3 videos already sent to me by attendees who witnessed what happened. Would you like me to play them back for you? Or would you prefer to leave quietly and preserve what little dignity you have remaining? Victoria's hands were shaking now, her carefully constructed facade crumbling like old paper. You'll regret this. We have friends. We have influence. One call and we can destroy this foundation's reputation. Please do make that call, Whitmore replied calmly. I welcome the opportunity to explain to anyone who'll listen why we expelled donors who couldn't manage basic human decency. I'm quite certain the story of how you treated a decorated war hero will play very well in the press. I'm sure your social circle will be fascinated to hear all about it. Beaumont spoke up again, his tone gentler now but no less firm. Madam, Monsieur, I suggest you do as Mr. Whitmore asks. Leave with what grace you can manage. Learn from this experience. Use it as an opportunity for reflection and growth. Or don't, and continue living your lives convinced that wealth equals worth. But either way, you will leave now, and you will leave this man alone. For a moment, Victoria looked like she might argue further. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. But whatever she saw in the faces around her, the cold judgment in dozens of pairs of eyes, finally broke through her denial. She set her champagne flute down on a nearby table with trembling hands, straightened her shoulders in a failed attempt at dignity, and turned to walk away. Richard followed, his face thunderous, already pulling out his phone to make whatever angry calls he thought would salvage their reputation. The crowd parted for them silently. No one spoke. No one said goodbye. They simply watched as Victoria and Richard Ashford walked the long path across the marble floor toward the exit, their expensive clothes and jewelry and carefully cultivated sophistication meaning nothing in the face of their exposed cruelty. The click of Victoria's heels echoed in the silence like a countdown to irrelevance. When they finally disappeared through the ballroom doors, a collective exhale rippled through the crowd. People began to murmur, their voices low and urgent. Daniel heard fragments of conversation floating past him. Can you believe? I always thought she was. That poor man. Did you see his face when? He wanted to disappear, to follow Victoria and Richard out those doors and escape into the night. But Beaumont's hand was still on his shoulder, anchoring him in place. My friend, the ambassador said softly, just for Daniel's ears. I know this is not what you wanted. I know you prefer the shadows. But sometimes the light finds us whether we seek it or not. And when it does, we must stand in it with grace. Daniel finally met his old commander's eyes. I just came to accept an award and go home to my daughter. I didn't want any of this. I know. But look around you. Beaumont gestured at the crowd. Look at their faces. You have given them something precious tonight. A reminder that heroism isn't always loud. That sacrifice doesn't always come with fanfare. That the person you dismiss might be the person who once walked into fire so others could live. He smiled. This is uncomfortable for you, yes. But it is necessary for them. They needed to see their own smallness reflected back at them. They needed to understand that worth cannot be measured in dollars or designer labels. Thomas Whitmore approached, still looking shaken. Mr. Reeves, I cannot express how sorry I am about what happened. That should never have occurred, especially not at an event meant to honor you. He ran a hand through his thinning hair. I'm canceling the Ashfords' membership immediately. They'll receive no further invitations to any of our events, and their names will be removed from our donor rolls and our website. That's not necessary, Daniel said quietly. People say things they don't mean. They make mistakes. No. Whitmore shook his head firmly. What they did wasn't a mistake. A mistake is using the wrong fork or forgetting someone's name. What they did was deliberate cruelty. They looked at you and made a conscious choice to diminish you, to humiliate you, to make themselves feel superior at your expense. That's not the kind of behavior we tolerate, regardless of how much money someone donates. He paused. Besides, I suspect once this story gets out, and it will get out because half the room recorded it, the Ashfords will have bigger problems than losing their membership here. Daniel felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. He thought about Emma, probably already asleep at his sister's house, dreaming whatever dreams 10-year-olds dream. Uncomplicated dreams, innocent dreams, dreams that didn't include public confrontations and exposed secrets and viral videos. He'd wanted tonight to be simple. Attend the gala, accept the award, maybe give Emma something to be proud of when he told her about it tomorrow. Instead, it had turned into exactly the kind of spectacle he'd spent years avoiding. If it's all the same to you, Daniel said, I think I'd like to skip the program. I'll just head home. Absolutely not. Beaumont's voice carried the tone of a commander giving an order, not a friend making a suggestion. You will stay. You will accept your award. You will let these people see you as you are. To leave now would be to let that woman win, to validate her claim that you don't belong here. He softened slightly. Besides, your daughter will want to hear all about tonight. What will you tell her? That you ran away? That you let someone's cruelty chase you from a room? Daniel knew he was right. He thought the same thing earlier, before Beaumont arrived, when he'd considered leaving. Emma would ask questions. She'd want details. She'd want to know if her dad had been brave, if he'd stood up for himself, if he'd been proud. What kind of lesson would he teach her if he disappeared now? Fine, he said finally. I'll stay. Good man. Beaumont clapped him on the back. Now, let me buy you a drink. Real French wine, not this California swill they're serving. I know the bartender, he keeps a bottle of Chateau Margaux for special occasions. And if this isn't a special occasion, I don't know what is. As they moved toward the bar, the crowd parted naturally, people stepping aside to let them pass. But the quality of the attention had changed. Where before there had been dismissal and indifference, now there was respect, even awe. People nodded as Daniel walked by. A few reached out to touch his arm gently, murmuring words he couldn't quite hear over the renewed buzz of conversation. The young woman in the red dress stepped forward, tears still wet on her cheeks. Mr. Reeves, she said, her voice breaking slightly. I'm so sorry. I should have said something. I should have defended you. I froze. I was a coward. She wiped at her eyes. My brother is in the Marines. He's deployed right now in Syria. And I just stood there while that woman treated you like you were nothing. I'm so ashamed. Daniel looked at her, this young woman who seemed genuinely devastated by her own inaction. He recognized that look. He'd seen it in the mirror often enough in his own life, moments when he'd failed to act, when fear or uncertainty or simple exhaustion had kept him silent when he should have spoken. You have nothing to apologize for, he said gently. Standing up to people like that is hard. Especially when they have power and you don't. I don't blame you. But I blame myself, she said. My brother is over there right now, risking his life, and I couldn't even find the courage to speak up in a ballroom. She laughed bitterly. Some sister I am. Your brother would be proud of you just for being here, for supporting causes that help people. Don't be too hard on yourself. Daniel paused. What's his name? Your brother? Marcus. Marcus Chen. When you write to him, tell Marcus that Daniel Reeves says thank you for his service. Tell him to keep his head down and come home safe. And tell him his sister is doing just fine. The young woman, Sarah Chen her name turned out to be, smiled through her tears and nodded. She stepped back into the crowd, but Daniel could feel her watching him as he and Beaumont continued toward the bar. The bartender, a distinguished-looking man in his 60s, brightened when he saw Beaumont approach. Colonel. I wondered if you'd make it tonight. His eyes flicked to Daniel, curiosity evident. And this is? This is Commander Daniel Reeves, an old friend and one of the finest soldiers I ever had the privilege of serving with. Daniel, meet Pierre Blanc, the only bartender in Chicago who knows the difference between wine and colored water. Pierre's eyes widened in recognition. He'd clearly heard the commotion, probably seen some of it. The gentleman from earlier. With the... He trailed off delicately. Yes, Beaumont said. The gentleman who reminded everyone in this room that character has nothing to do with clothing budgets. Pierre, do you still have that Margot I brought you last month? I do indeed. Pierre ducked below the bar and emerged with a dusty bottle that probably cost more than Daniel's monthly rent. He poured 2 generous glasses with the careful attention of someone handling liquid art. I'm a house, gentlemen. And Mr. Reeves, for what it's worth, that woman is well known in certain circles for her, he searched for the right word, abrasive personality. You're not the first person she's treated poorly. Just the first one who had a French ambassador to set the record straight. They took their wine to a quieter corner of the ballroom, away from the main crowd but still visible enough that Daniel could feel eyes tracking their movement. Beaumont raised his glass. To old friends and new beginnings. Daniel touched his glass to Beaumont's but didn't drink immediately. You didn't have to do that. Intervene, I mean. I could have handled it. I know you could have. That's not why I intervened. Beaumont took a sip of wine, savoring it. I intervened because I was angry. Angry at her, yes, but also angry at all of them. At a society that teaches people to measure worth by such superficial standards. At a culture that celebrates wealth while dismissing service. He set his glass down. I've been to 100 events like this, Daniel. Charity galas where rich people congratulate themselves for writing checks. And don't misunderstand, the money helps. The hospitals get built, the research gets funded, the programs get supported. But somewhere along the way, they forgot that charity begins with how you treat the person standing in front of you. That compassion isn't just about donations, it's about dignity. She'll face consequences, Daniel said. Whitmore banned them. The videos will spread. Their reputation will take a hit. Good. Beaumont's voice was firm. Actions should have consequences. She humiliated you publicly, she should face public accountability. Maybe she'll learn something from it. Maybe she won't. But either way, other people will see what happened to her and think twice before treating someone that way. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, sipping wine that tasted like bottled sunshine. Daniel let himself relax incrementally, his shoulders dropping from their military rigidity. Around them, the gala continued. People had begun to move on from the drama, returning to their conversations and their networking and their silent auction bids. But Daniel noticed that the quality of the glances sent his way had changed fundamentally. No one looked through him anymore. No one dismissed him as irrelevant. He'd become visible in a way he'd never wanted but couldn't now undo. A woman in her 40s approached their corner, walking with the confident stride of someone used to commanding attention. She wore a midnight blue gown and pearls, and her expression was thoughtful rather than curious. "Excuse me, gentlemen. I don't mean to interrupt, but I wanted to introduce myself. I'm Catherine Morrison. I sit on the board of the Rosewood Foundation." She extended her hand first to Beaumont, then to Daniel. "Mr. Reeves, I witnessed what happened earlier, and I wanted to apologize on behalf of the foundation. The Ashfords' behavior was inexcusable, and I'm mortified that you were subjected to that treatment at an event meant to honor you." "Thank you," Daniel said simply, unsure what else to say. "I also wanted you to know that the board will be meeting tomorrow to discuss how we can prevent something like this from happening again. We clearly need better screening processes for our major donors. Money shouldn't buy anyone the right to treat others cruelly." She paused. "Additionally, we'd like to increase the amount of your honorarium. The standard award is $5,000, but we're raising yours to $25,000. It's not about the money, it's about the message. We want everyone to know that we value what you do, that your contributions to this community matter enormously." Daniel's throat tightened. $25,000. That was 4 months of his salary. That was Emma's college fund growing significantly. That was security he hadn't dared hope for. That's very generous. "Thank you. It's the least we can do." Catherine smiled warmly. "I looked into your work at Lincoln Elementary after I heard about tonight's nomination. The teachers there say the building runs better than it has in 20 years. They say students actually look forward to seeing you because you remember their names, ask about their interests, treat them like people rather than problems. That's not just maintenance work, Mr. Reeves. That's mentorship. That's leadership. That's exactly what we should be celebrating tonight." After Catherine departed, Beaumont turned to Daniel with a knowing look. "You see? The tide has turned. You came here expecting to be invisible, and now you're the most talked about person in the room. How does it feel?" "Uncomfortable," Daniel admitted. "I liked being invisible. I liked people not knowing my history. Now it's going to be everywhere. The videos, the news stories, the social media posts. My phone is probably already blowing up with messages from people I haven't talked to in years." "Fame is fleeting," Beaumont assured him. "Next week, some celebrity will do something scandalous and everyone will forget about tonight. But the people who matter, the ones who saw what happened and understood its meaning, they won't forget. They'll remember the man who stood with dignity in the face of cruelty. They'll remember that character matters more than appearance." He finished his wine. "And your daughter, she'll remember that her father didn't run away. That he faced his humiliation and came out the other side with his integrity intact. That's worth more than any amount of privacy." The ballroom lights dimmed slightly, signaling that the program was about to begin. A voice over the sound system asked everyone to please find their seats. Beaumont and Daniel made their way to the front of the room where a table had been reserved for the evening's honorees. Daniel found his place card, Commander Daniel Reeves, printed in elegant script. Someone had updated his title. He wondered if Whitmore had done that, or if Beaumont had quietly arranged it. The 4 other honorees were already seated. They introduced themselves as Daniel and Beaumont approached. There was Maria Santos, a nurse who'd organized free health clinics in underserved neighborhoods. James Wright, a retired teacher who'd started an after-school literacy program. Denise Park, a social worker who'd created a housing program for homeless veterans. And Robert Kim, a firefighter who'd pulled 6 children from a burning apartment building. They were all ordinary people doing extraordinary things, all wearing their best clothes which ranged from perfectly tailored to clearly borrowed, and all looking slightly overwhelmed by the grandeur of the event. Maria leaned over to Daniel as the lights dimmed further. "I heard what happened earlier. With that horrible woman. Are you okay?" Her voice carried the gentle concern of someone whose profession was caring for others. "I'm fine," Daniel said, and was surprised to find it was mostly true. The initial sting of humiliation had faded, replaced by a strange sort of peace. He'd survived worse than Victoria Ashford's cruelty. He'd survived situations where survival seemed impossible. A few cutting words in a ballroom couldn't break him. I'm glad they kicked her out, James said from across the table. I've been coming to these events for 3 years since I started getting recognized for the literacy work, and I've watched people like her treat waitstaff like servants and dismiss anyone they consider beneath them. It's about time someone faced consequences. Denise nodded emphatically. The way she talked to you, it made me so angry. I work with homeless veterans every single day. Men and women who served their country and ended up on the streets because of PTSD or addiction or just bad luck. And people like her walk past them without even seeing them. Like they're invisible. Like their service doesn't matter because they're not successful by society's standards. My grandfather was in Vietnam, Robert added quietly. Came home to people spitting on him, calling him a baby killer. He never talked about his service after that. Spent 4 years pretending it never happened because he was ashamed of how people treated him. He looked at Daniel. What you did tonight, standing there and taking it with dignity, that mattered. My grandfather would have been proud to see that. The program began with Thomas Whitmore taking the stage. He looked composed now, his earlier agitation replaced by professional warmth. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 15th Annual Rosewood Foundation Gala. Tonight, we gather to celebrate the extraordinary individuals who make our community stronger, kinder, and more compassionate through their tireless service and dedication. Whitmore spoke about the Foundation's mission, the programs they funded, the lives they'd touched. He thanked the donors and sponsors, though Daniel noticed he conspicuously didn't mention the Ashfords despite their years of support. Then he began introducing the honorees, starting with Maria. She walked to the stage with humble grace, accepted her award, and gave a brief speech about the importance of healthcare access for all people regardless of their ability to pay. The audience applauded warmly. James was next, then Denise, then Robert. Each gave moving speeches about their work, about the communities they served, about why service mattered to them. Each received standing ovations. And then it was Daniel's turn. Our final honoree tonight, Whitmore said, his voice taking on a different quality, something deeper and more significant, is someone whose story you may have already heard if you've been paying attention to the conversations happening in this room over the past hour. Commander Daniel Reeves served for 8 years in the French Foreign Legion, where he distinguished himself through extraordinary valor and was awarded France's highest honor for his service. After leaving the military, Commander Reeves chose a different path. He became a maintenance supervisor at Lincoln Elementary School, where he's worked for the past 3 years. But his title doesn't begin to describe what he does. Whitmore looked down at his notes, but Daniel could tell he wasn't really reading them. He was speaking from something more personal now. Commander Reeves volunteers 3 nights a week working with students who need extra support. He teaches them practical skills, helps with homework, and provides a steady, reliable presence for children who often lack that in their lives. Teachers at Lincoln say he knows every student's name. He asks about their interests, remembers their birthdays, celebrates their achievements. One teacher told me that students often seek him out just to talk, that they trust him in a way they don't always trust other adults. Daniel felt his face heating up. This was worse than the humiliation earlier. At least then he'd been able to maintain some emotional distance. But hearing his work described this way, hearing the impact he'd tried so hard to keep quiet laid bare for everyone to hear, that was harder to take. What makes Commander Reeves truly special, Whitmore continued, isn't just what he does but how he does it. With humility. With consistency. With genuine care for every person he encounters. He doesn't seek recognition. He doesn't want attention. He simply shows up every day and makes life better for the people around him. That is the definition of service. That is the definition of character. And that is exactly what we should be celebrating tonight. The audience rose to their feet as Daniel made his way to the stage. The applause was thunderous, but he barely heard it. He was too busy trying to keep his emotions in check, trying to maintain the composure that had served him through so many difficult moments. Whitmore handed him a crystal award, heavy and elegant, with his name and the Foundation's logo etched into the glass. They shook hands. The applause continued. Daniel stood at the podium, looking out at hundreds of faces all turned toward him. Some were familiar from earlier, the crowd that had witnessed his humiliation and his vindication. Others were new, people who'd been scattered throughout the ballroom during the confrontation but had heard about it through the inevitable gossip networks. All of them were waiting to hear what he would say. He hadn't prepared a speech. He'd assumed he'd just say thank you and sit down. But standing there now, feeling the weight of the moment, he realized he needed to say something more. Not for himself, but for Emma. For the students at Lincoln Elementary. For all the people who felt invisible because society had taught them they didn't matter. "Thank you," Daniel began, his voice steady despite the emotions churning in his chest. "I'm not good at speeches. I'm better at fixing things than talking about fixing things. But I want to say a few words about service, since that's what tonight is supposed to be about." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I think we've lost sight of what service really means. We think it means grand gestures and big donations and having your name on buildings. And those things are important, don't get me wrong. Money builds hospitals and funds research and creates programs that help people. But service, real service, happens in the small moments. It happens when you take time to learn someone's name. When you listen to their story. When you see them as a full human being instead of just a problem to solve or an obstacle to navigate around." The room was absolutely silent now. Earlier tonight, someone looked at me and saw my cheap suit and my worn shoes and decided I didn't belong here. That I wasn't worthy of respect because I didn't look successful by their standards. And that hurt, I won't lie about that. It hurt because we all want to be seen, to be valued, to matter. But here's what I learned from that experience. Daniel looked directly at the table where Victoria and Richard had been sitting. It was empty now, but he spoke as if they were still there. When you treat someone badly because of how they look or what they do for a living, you don't diminish them. You diminish yourself. You reveal that your sense of worth is so fragile, so dependent on external validation, that you need to tear others down to feel elevated. And that's sad. That's a poverty of spirit that no amount of money can fix. He shifted his attention to the broader audience. The truth is, we're all just people trying to do our best with what we have. Some of us have more resources, more opportunities, more luck. Some of us have less. But none of that determines our value as human beings. What determines our value is how we treat each other. How we show up for our communities. Whether we choose kindness or cruelty when no one is watching. Daniel held up the Crystal Award. "This is beautiful, and I'm honored to receive it. But it's not why I do what I do. I do it because I have a daughter who's watching me. Who's learning from my example what it means to be a good person. I do it because I remember being a kid who needed adults to show up for me, and I want to be that adult for other kids. I do it because service isn't about recognition. It's about recognizing the humanity in everyone we meet and treating them accordingly." He felt tears threatening and pushed them back. "So thank you to the Rosewood Foundation for this honor. Thank you to Ambassador Beaumont for your friendship and your support. Thank you to everyone who saw what happened tonight and understood that dignity isn't dependent on designer labels. And to anyone watching who feels invisible, who feels like they don't matter because they're not wealthy or famous or important by society's standards, I want you to know something." Daniel's voice grew stronger, more certain. "You matter. Your work matters. Your kindness matters. The way you show up for your family, your community, your job, that matters. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Don't let anyone make you feel small because you don't meet their arbitrary standards of success. Real success is measured in lives touched, in kindness given, in love shared. Everything else is just noise." The applause started before he finished his last sentence and built to a roar as he stepped away from the podium. People weren't just clapping, they were cheering. Several were crying openly. Sarah Chen, the young woman who'd apologized earlier, was sobbing into her hands. Catherine Morrison was nodding emphatically, her own eyes wet. Even the wait staff had stopped their work to applaud, something Daniel had never seen at an event like this. He made his way back to his table, accepting handshakes and pats on the back from people he passed. Maria hugged him tightly. "That was perfect," she whispered. "That was exactly what needed to be said." The other honorees echoed her sentiment. Beaumont simply gripped his shoulder and nodded, understanding passing between them without words. The rest of the program passed in a blur. There was dinner, though Daniel barely tasted the expensive food on his plate. There were more speeches, presentations about the foundation's work, a video montage of the honorees. Through it all, Daniel felt like he was watching from a distance, not quite present in the moment. His mind kept drifting to Emma, to what he'd tell her tomorrow, to how he'd explain everything that had happened. As the evening wound down and people began to leave, several attendees approached Daniel's table. They wanted to shake his hand, to thank him for his speech, to tell him their own stories of feeling dismissed or undervalued. A businessman in his 60s admitted that he'd grown up poor and still felt like an imposter in rooms like this despite his success. A young couple told him about the teacher who'd changed their son's life through patient attention and care. An elderly woman pressed a check into his hand, made out to Lincoln Elementary School for $10,000, designated for the after-school program. Thomas Whitmore approached as the crowd thinned. "Commander Reeves, I wanted to give you this before you left." He handed Daniel an envelope. "It's your honorarium, plus our contact information. We'd like to feature your story in our next newsletter, with your permission. We think it could inspire other donors to think differently about what service means." "I'd prefer to keep a low profile," Daniel said honestly. "Tonight was already more attention than I'm comfortable with." "I understand, and will respect that. But think about it. Your message tonight resonated with people. It changed how they think about charity and service and human worth. That's powerful. That's worth sharing." Whitmore smiled. "No pressure though. You've already given us more than we could have asked for." Beaumont had been waiting patiently, and now he stood. "Come, my friend. I'll give you a ride home. We can catch up properly, away from all these people and their phones." They walked together through the now mostly empty ballroom. The cleaning crew had already started their work, clearing tables and sweeping floors. Daniel caught the eye of one of the janitors, a young Hispanic man pushing a cart not unlike the ones Daniel used at Lincoln Elementary. Their eyes met, and the man nodded respectfully. Daniel nodded back, a moment of recognition passing between them. Two invisible men who kept the world running smoothly while others took the credit. Beaumont's car was waiting outside, a sleek black sedan with diplomatic plates. The driver opened the door, and they settled into leather seats that smelled of luxury. As they pulled away from the Grand Meridian Hotel, Daniel watched it recede in the side mirror, its golden lights growing smaller and smaller until they disappeared entirely. "That was quite a speech," Beaumont said after a few minutes of comfortable silence. "I've heard many speeches in my life, at ceremonies and galas and state dinners. Yours was better than most because it was true. You meant every word." "I did," Daniel confirmed. "I'm just not sure it will change anything. People like Victoria Ashford, they don't change. They'll be embarrassed for a while, maybe lay low for a few months. But eventually they'll convince themselves they were the victims, that they were treated unfairly. And they'll go right back to treating other people the same way." "Perhaps," Beaumont agreed. "But others will change. I saw it in their faces tonight. People who recognized themselves in your description of cruelty and superficiality. People who felt convicted by your words and will think twice before dismissing someone based on appearances." He looked out the window at the Chicago streets sliding past. "We cannot save everyone, Daniel. We cannot fix every broken thing in the world. But we can plant seeds. We can shine light into dark corners. We can remind people of who they could be if they tried. That's all any of us can do." They drove through familiar neighborhoods, past the elementary school where Daniel worked, past the small apartment building where he and Emma lived. Beaumont insisted on walking him to the door despite Daniel's protests that it wasn't necessary. "When will you pick up Emma?" the ambassador asked as they stood in the lobby. "Tomorrow morning. Early. She'll want to hear everything, and I'm not sure how much to tell her." How do you explain to a 10-year-old that some people are cruel for no good reason? That the world isn't always fair? You tell her the truth, Beaumont said simply. You tell her what happened, and you tell her how you responded with dignity. You show her that we cannot control how others treat us, but we can always control how we respond. That is the most important lesson you can teach her. They shook hands at the elevator, and Beaumont pulled him into a brief embrace. I am proud of you, mon ami. Proud of the soldier you were and the man you have become. Your daughter is lucky to have you. I'm the lucky one, Daniel replied. She's the reason I do any of this. The reason I keep trying to be better. After Beaumont left, Daniel rode the elevator up to his third-floor apartment. It was small and modest, nothing like the penthouses and mansions where most of tonight's attendees lived. But it was clean and safe and filled with memories of Emma growing up. Her artwork covered the refrigerator. Her shoes were scattered by the door. Her backpack hung on its designated hook, waiting for Monday morning. Daniel changed out of his suit, hanging it carefully in the closet. He'd probably never wear it again. It would always carry the weight of tonight, the humiliation and the vindication, the moment when his past collided with his present in the most public way possible. He put on sweatpants and an old t-shirt, made himself a cup of tea, and sat at the kitchen table with the envelope Whitmore had given him. Inside was a check for $25,000 and a handwritten note thanking him for his service to the community. There was also a business card for Catherine Morrison with a message on the back, "Call me. I have ideas about how we might expand your after-school program. The city needs more people like you." Daniel set the check aside and pulled out his phone. It had been on silent all evening, and now he saw dozens of messages waiting. Texts from his sister asking how the gala went. Messages from teachers at Lincoln Elementary who'd apparently seen the videos already spreading online. An email from a local news station requesting an interview. 3 voicemails from numbers he didn't recognize. He ignored most of them and called his sister. She answered on the first ring. "Daniel. I've been watching the videos. Oh my God, what happened? Are you okay? Is that really the French ambassador? Did that woman really say those things to you?" He smiled at her rapid-fire questions, so characteristically Rachel. "I'm fine. It was intense but I'm fine. Is Emma asleep?" "Passed out about an hour ago. She made me read 3 chapters of her book and told me about 17 different things that happened at school this week. That child can talk." Rachel's voice softened. "Seriously though, are you okay? Those things that woman said were horrible." "I've survived worse," Daniel said, and it was true. "It stung in the moment, but I'm okay now. Better than okay, actually. The foundation increased my honorarium. $25,000. Rachel gasped. "Daniel, that's amazing. You can finally fix your car. And get Emma those dance lessons she's been asking about. And maybe, I don't know, buy yourself a new suit?" She laughed at her own joke. "Maybe," Daniel agreed, though he was already thinking about other things. The check would go into Emma's college fund mostly. Maybe a little for dance lessons. Maybe a small emergency fund for the inevitable unexpected expenses that came with single parenthood. The suit could wait. They talked for a few more minutes before hanging up, and then Daniel sat in the quiet of his apartment, drinking his tea and processing everything that had happened. In the span of 4 hours, he'd gone from invisible to visible, from dismissed to celebrated, from humiliated to vindicated. He'd been forced to reveal parts of his past he'd kept carefully hidden. He'd given a speech that apparently moved people. He'd watched cruel people face consequences for their cruelty. And through it all, he'd maintained his dignity. That was what mattered most. Not the award or the money or the recognition. The fact that when someone tried to make him feel small, he'd refused to shrink. He'd stood tall in his cheap suit and worn shoes and reminded everyone in that room that worth couldn't be measured in dollars. His phone buzzed with a new message. He picked it up and saw it was from Sarachan, the young woman in the red dress. "Thank you for tonight. For showing me what courage looks like. I called my brother and told him about you. He says you're exactly the kind of leader he hopes to be someday. Thank you for your service, both past and present. Daniel typed back a simple reply. Thank you for your brother's service. Tell him to stay safe and come home soon. The world needs more good people. He finished his tea, turned off the lights, and went to bed. Tomorrow he'd pick up Emma and tell her about the gala. He'd figure out how to explain the videos that would inevitably find their way to her classmates' parents. He'd decide whether to call Catherine Morrison about expanding the after-school program. He'd return to his normal life, though that life would be slightly different now that his invisibility had been stripped away. But tonight, he was just a tired single father in a small apartment, grateful to be home, grateful for his daughter, grateful for the life he'd built from the ashes of loss and trauma. The Crystal Award sat on his kitchen counter, catching the streetlight coming through the window. It was beautiful. But it wasn't nearly as beautiful as the thought of Emma's face tomorrow morning when he told her that her dad had been brave, that he'd stood up for what was right, that he'd shown the world what true dignity looked like. That was the real award. Everything else was just noise. And as Daniel drifted off to sleep, he smiled, thinking about pancakes and stories and a little girl who believed her father could do anything. Because in her eyes, he could. And that belief, that love, that faith was worth more than all the Crystal Awards and charity galas in the world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.